In modern multi-domain warfare, a nation's most catastrophic vulnerability isn't hiding somewhere on the battlefield. It's the fatal arrogance hardwired directly into its own strategic architecture. Study the opening 48 hours of Operation Epic Fury, projecting thousands of tons of precision kinetic payload onto a coordinate grid over 1,000 nautical miles away is never an act of emotion. It is cold, industrial execution. You are threading strings of 2,000-pound penetrators from altitude and cruise missiles rising from the ocean floor. You are launching them from completely separated spatial vectors, different altitudes, different airspeeds, and you are forcing every single one of them to violently converge on the enemy's nerve center at the exact same absolute millisecond. That requires no rage whatsoever. It demands something infinitely colder. It demands the unforgiving doctrine of time on target. And into that ruthless kinetic machine, the enemy voluntarily inserted a suicidal miscalculation. Why did the IRGC willingly compress their most expensive, most celebrated combat ecosystem into a claustrophobic inner harbor? Why did they hand the massive radar cross-section of their entire surface fleet directly to the United States global sensor grid? To their supreme leadership, it appeared to be a stronghold. But through the eyes of an American military architect, that wasn't a concentration of power. That was an adversary permanently locking their own fleet inside an inescapable geometric trap. Bandar Abbas was never a fortress. To us, it was a target-rich environment, a kinetic reality where the final output is always identical. Erasure. The coordinate grid was locked. The execution protocol was loaded into the kill chain. But before we break down the lethal anatomy of this machine, we have to understand the physical iron cage where this trap was actually sprung. The greatest enemy of the US military in this multi-domain campaign wasn't Iran's Bavar 373 air defense system. It wasn't Russian-supplied S-400 batteries. The enemy was space itself. The enemy was the hard limit of geography. Reaching the core targets meant solving a lethal logistics and combat radius problem spanning roughly 800 to 1,075 nautical miles. Our machine doesn't close distance to engage. The kinetic payload was released from the absolute outer edges of the physical map. From the supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford, operating in the eastern Mediterranean. From the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group holding position in the Arabian Sea, and from remote strategic bases in Diego Garcia and Cyprus, all converging to decapitate the nerve center of the Iranian Navy at Bandar Abbas. The precision-guided munitions network had to cut through thousands of nautical miles of contested airspace. And at the geographic center of that iron cage sits the Strait of Hormuz, a mere 21 nautical miles wide at its tightest choke point. Yet it is the jugular vein pumping roughly 20% of the world's crude oil and LNG directly into the global economic bloodstream. Positioned right along its southern coast is Bandar Abbas Naval Base, not just a base, the nerve center of Iran's heavy surface fleet and IRGC naval swarms. Iran was holding a geopolitical blade directly against the world's energy artery, fully prepared to suffocate the Western supply chain. But their strategic thinking had completely decayed under the weight of complacency. Rather than leveraging the vastness of open ocean to disperse and preserve their combat power, they blindly worshipped the doctrine of exquisite platforms. They voluntarily compressed their entire combat ecosystem into a shallow basin and claustrophobic dry docks. The backbone of their surface force, the Mauj-class frigates, were completely stripped of maneuvering space. Their underwater stealth deterrent, the Kilo-class diesel-electric attack submarines, were forced to expose their most critical vulnerabilities right on the hardstand. Even their most ambitious blue water assets, including the 133,000 short-ton expeditionary sea base Iris Makran and the UAV carrier Iris Shahid Bagheri, were deadlocked inside an impossibly tight pier-side geometry. They weren't concentrating combat power, they were constructing a physical saturation point. Every one of their most expensive war machines had become a silent steel block, dormant and stationary, converting the entire basin into a massive electromagnetic bullseye. That is precisely why, through the eyes of CENTCOM's radar cross-section analysts, Bandar Abbas was no longer a fortress. It was a standing invitation for annihilation. The coordinate grid was set. The death sentence was rendered. The mainstream media endlessly speculated about why Iran's celebrated integrated air defense network went completely silent, never grasping that sheer overmatch in multi-domain warfare grants the adversary exactly 0 reaction time. We don't use raw muscle to kick down the enemy's front door. We reshape the entire physical environment surrounding them. The kill chain doesn't initiate with a kinetic boom. It begins by ruthlessly exploiting systemic fragility at its deepest root. At precisely 0945 hours local time, as the execution timeline hit 0, a multi-tiered cyber campaign was dropped directly into the enemy's core data infrastructure from orbit, throttling national bandwidth and forcing transmission capacity into freefall, collapsing it to roughly 1% of operational capacity. For the systems engineers managing the U.S. battle network, that forced civilian bottleneck was deliberately engineered to trigger an irreversible cascading failure at the military level. Because the moment civilian infrastructure collapsed, desperate overflow traffic instantly flooded and saturated all military backup communication bands, creating a fatal physical fracture that severed command and control nodes from central Tehran, all the way down to the naval commanders stationed at Bandar Abbas. When air traffic control screens drowned in white noise and all data streams locked out, the OODA loop of the IRGC High Command was thrown off a cliff into total paralysis. Not a single fleet dispersal order was transmitted. Not a single propeller shaft had time to spool up and escape. The entire fleet was automatically stripped of its maneuverability and permanently pinned within an impossibly tight geometric kill box. That is the ruthless law of modern warfare. When the central brain is blinded and clinically dead, it doesn't matter how much steel muscle surrounds it. It becomes nothing but a silent kinetic target waiting to be vaporized. At the exact moment, the enemy's nervous system was convulsing in total disconnect. The second kinetic trap was triggered. The U.S. flooded the battle space with hundreds of ADM-160 MALD miniature air-launched decoys, combined with dense swarms of low-cost loitering munitions, generating a data tsunami engineered to overwhelm the processing capacity of every early warning radar site in the network. This wasn't standard misdirection. This was physics manipulation. Each ADM-160 MALD carries 0 explosives. Its weapon is pure mathematical deception. The signature augmentation subsystem embedded inside each MALD operates like a reality distortion engine, emitting sophisticated electromagnetic signatures that inflate the radar cross-section of a 300-pound airframe into the massive digital footprint of a B-52 strategic bomber or an F-15E Strike Eagle. For Iranian radar operators staring in desperation at their scopes, the algorithm had perfectly cloned a massive inbound strike package, painting phantom squadrons of F-15S and F-16S screaming toward Iranian airspace at high subsonic speeds. By injecting that enormous volume of spoofed data directly into the veins of their air defense network, we forced their fire control computers to solve meaningless equations, completely overflowing sensor buffers and permanently degrading target discrimination capability. We hijacked their attention entirely, forcing SAM batteries to burn multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles chasing electromagnetic ghosts into the empty sky. Once celebrated billion-dollar air defense complexes like the Bavar 373 and S-400 batteries were overwhelmed and neutralized not by brute force, but by the laws of electromagnetic physics. With the defensive perimeter systematically disassembled, 5th-generation stealth platforms, F-35s and F-22 Raptors, operating under the full protection of a broad-spectrum electronic warfare dome cast by EA-18G Growlers, methodically carved open the target airspace without registering a single ripple on any remaining radar scope. Iran's defensive network wasn't overpowered. It was being surgically disassembled by our system in the most calculated, cold-blooded manner possible. When the adversary's sensor grid was completely blinded and deafened by the electromagnetic storm, the industrial delivery machine began the methodical process of pulverizing physical infrastructure. The kill chain tempo was pushed to its absolute ceiling. Ordnance volume surged by 1,260%, marking the full convergence of an absolute logistics air bridge. over 1,500 total sorties, heavily front-loaded with aerial refuelers, AWACS platforms, and electronic warfare nodes, enabling a kinetic spearhead of just 400 dedicated strike platforms, raining down over 4,000 precision-guided munitions. The objective defined by the system was never simple victory. It was absolute strategic paralysis inside a 48-hour lethal window, where the time-on-target equation operated like a death clock that could not deviate by a single millisecond. The opening wave carried no theatrical flair. It was a mechanical data output sequence. Everything originated from a few kilobytes of encrypted command strings transmitted down to the Mark 41 VLS cells aboard Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, holding position in the Persian Gulf. No battle cries, no warnings, just electromagnetic relays, closing circuits, and solid fuel ignition systems cycling to life. Dozens of BGM-109 Tomahawks cleared their launch tubes on pure mechanical thrust, and the moment they crested the deck, radar altimeter algorithms ruthlessly seized flight control, pitching tons of precision steel down to sea-skimming altitude and locking the systems into a terrain-hugging flight profile, holding Turcom navigation offline until coastline crossing. By holding just feet above the surface and exploiting the curvature of the Earth itself, this kinetic package slipped invisibly beneath every blind spot in the electromagnetic spectrum. They didn't need radar-absorbent materials. They achieved stealth through geometry. The moment fusing systems locked final coordinates, there was no battlefield emotion, only the absolute release of kinetic energy according to the laws of physics. The 1,000-pound penetrator warheads transferred their energy completely, erasing early warning antenna arrays and grinding reinforced concrete command and control routing nodes into mechanical dust. In CENTCOM's operational blueprint, the destruction of the fleet at Bandar Abbas was never assigned to this opening wave. The Tomahawks were a surgical scalpel, a precision-clearing tool coldly carving mathematically perfect safe corridors for the heavy kinetic payload screaming in directly behind them. Approximately 30 minutes after the Tomahawk wave finished cutting through the defensive cage, a sterile spatial corridor, resistance reduced to absolute zero, was fully open. That is when the American logistics machine pumped the full kinetic payload into the coordinate grid from altitudes far beyond any remaining interception envelope. B-2 Spirit strategic bomber platforms, launching from the continental United States, initiated the freefall sequence of precision strings of 2,000-pound GBU-31 JDAM munitions. Their massive kinetic energy transferred on impact, shattering the structural integrity of hardened launch pads and completely obliterating submarine pens. But within the architecture of networked lethality, no single platform operates as an independent entity. The B-2 carries tremendous mechanical payload, but it is only the sledgehammer. The true brain of the equation lives in the sensor fusion layer operating beneath it. F-15, F-22, F-35, and EA-18. G platforms were synchronized into a single unified computational organism. It began with electromagnetic suppression under the radiation dome generated by the EA-18G Growlers, locking down the entire enemy electromagnetic spectrum. Exploiting that enforced blind spot, 5th generation F-22 and F-35 stealth assets penetrated the air defense network without detection, not to fire blindly, but to function as forward sensor nodes, silently scanning via synthetic aperture radar, collecting electro-optical signatures and uploading real-time coordinates to a secure data link continuously. Trailing them, F-15E Strike Eagle bomb trucks never powered their own radars. Emitting RF energy means exposing your position. They flew in complete electromagnetic silence, receiving targeting parameters directly from the F-35s and F-22s. Any mobile enemy radar system that dared activate from a concealed position was instantly absorbed into the shared targeting grid. The F-35 detected and designated. The F-15E served as the execution node, placing precision 2,000-pound JDAMs directly onto the decrypted coordinates. A perfectly closed loop. data to kinetic energy with zero gap. The only behavioral vulnerability remaining in a collapsing defensive structure is the desperate impulse to reboot early warning radars. In this kill web, that impulse became automatic self-destruction. FA-18. Super Hornets loitering offshore never penetrated the jamming envelope. They operated as passive launch rails. The instant any enemy antenna pushed an RF signal into the environment, that emission was captured, cross-referenced across the data link, and assigned an automatic vector lock. The transmitter was erased before the radar operator's display could compile a single byte of targeting data. The complete data flow, from F-35 optical targeting through Growler jamming parameters down to Super Hornet ballistic vectors, was routed, filtered, and bandwidth managed through a single central flying server, the E-2D Hawkeye Airborne Battle Management Node. And this is the most ruthless nature of networked lethality. The system does not depend on traditional numerical superiority. It is governed entirely by the equation of absolute time synchronization. Firepower is unleashed simultaneously from completely disjointed physical spaces. Submarines on the ocean floor, destroyers on the surface, strategic flying fortresses in the upper atmosphere, and stealth fighters threading through the clouds. Every platform releases its payload from entirely out-of-phase orbital vectors, incompatible airspeeds, and separated altitudes. Yet CENTCOM's multi-domain guidance algorithm took all of that spatial chaos and bent it into agonizingly precise temporal order, forcing thousands of separate kinetic packages to converge, punch through the atmosphere, and physically impact the Bandar Abbas coordinate grid at the exact same absolute millisecond. There was no first wave and second wave striking the port. There was only a single impact point in physical space generating a thermal and kinetic shockwave that made structural integrity of every target a mathematical impossibility. The outcome at the naval base cannot be categorized as a naval battle. You cannot call it a battle when the adversary's capacity to resist is mathematically zero. It was an erasure. Optical remote sensing data returned a cold battle damage assessment. Water surface stained with carbon residue. Dry dock structures pulverized to rubble. Secondary fires burning uncontrolled across the southern pier. U.S. Central Command confirmed 17 core surface platforms of the Iranian Navy completely neutralized. The conventional surface force was annihilated before a single internal combustion cycle of their engines could turn over. The entire fleet had sealed its own fate through a fundamental geometric error committed right at the pier. The exquisite platform doctrine collapsed against the law of conservation of energy. The 133,000 short-ton ESB Iris Makran had its entire superstructure sheared off and reduced to uncontrolled secondary fires at the southern pier, permanently severing Iran's blue water projection capability. The UAV carrier, Iris Shahid Bagheri, absorbed a direct kinetic impulse, lost buoyancy permanently, and sank at her own mooring. Even the underwater stealth assets, the Kilo-class diesel electrics, suffered complete thermal deformation, sealed inside their bone-dry docks. And when the hull of the Jamaran-class frigate ruptured and sank at Chabahar, the A2/AD anti-access network was officially broken. The system broadcast one absolute parameter: math beats mass. The talking heads called this a simple airstrike. They were completely wrong. This was a masterclass in American industrial dominance executed at machine precision. But let's be absolutely clear about one thing. Algorithms don't defend a nation. The men and women of the United States Armed Forces do. There is no networked lethality without the American intellect that designed it and the quiet, resolute dedication of the operators who execute it. Every subsystem, From silent cyber operations running from orbit to the electromagnetic storms clearing the sky, was held together by the steady hands of our sailors, pilots, and engineers. It demands absolute mastery of the craft to orchestrate thousands of tons of payload across completely disjointed spatial vectors. It demands an unbreakable human spirit to force out-of-phase altitudes and incompatible airspeeds to perfectly converge on a single grid coordinate at the exact same millisecond. That isn't just cold physics. That is the ultimate, unapologetic footprint of American resolve. And when our people fully integrate that level of brilliance with that level of discipline, American overmatch is no longer a theory. It becomes a mathematical guarantee.